exists, really. So we have the Hammerstrom stories, that book at the back. Proceeds from that help us with the festival. And when Fran passed, I worked with her in a literary capacity the last 10 years of her life. And we started a fund at Encourage Foundation. That fund helps to underwrite the nature writers and authors we have tonight. In person is going to be Emily Stone, seated back there. She's the author of Natural Connections 1 and 2. So she'll start up at 7. So we're going to introduce Lita via Zoom. There will be an opportunity for you to do questions, and she can answer them. Thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Great. I wish I could be there in person. I miss Wisconsin. It's been a couple of years since I've been able to go back, but it's an honor to be speaking with you tonight and to be remembering my grandparents as well. I'm a children's book author, as you know, and I really owe my lifetime career to my grandmother, who, for those of you who know her, knew that she was passionate about writing as well as about science and birds and ornithology. And when I knew her, later in life, when she had, my grandparents had retired, she was working. Really, I think her priority was in writing, and she wrote both for adults and for children. But she kind of was a huge role model to me and really set me on my course. So it's a privilege to talk about my grandparents and how they influenced me and led me to my work. I'm going to share a slideshow first, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to share screen because I have a bunch of slides to show, and hopefully you can see this. Does everybody see the first slide? It's a bunch of books. Okay, great. So these are some of my books. I've written 35 that are out so far. I just signed a contract late last night for my 38th book. I have 3 in the works right now. So Fran, she really lit the torch under me. When I wrote my first book, which was about them, I had no idea that I would be doing this for the rest of my life. But I found that I was as passionate about writing as she was. But it all started with just being a youngster who had the good fortune to grow up with a family of naturalists. And I want to include my parents a little bit in this because my mother, who was my grandparents, were her parents. She really followed in their footsteps, and she married my dad, who was a soil scientist and a naturalist. And I was born on a little island off the coast of Alaska and spent much of my early childhood camping or living in a car or a tent or moving around, following my dad with his work, and also visiting my grandparents constantly. And so my parents were passionate about wildlife. My dad did a lot of wildlife photography, and my mother, also a photographer, but also a nature journal writer, which really inspired me to keep a journal when I was a kid. I just had the good fortune to grow up in a family that sat in the woods and observed the world around them and kept notes in a journal. And my grandmother used to pound on the door at 4 a.m. every morning when we were there, and told us to get up and get out to the marsh and make observations. And I would record things in journals because that's what I saw my mother doing. It's what I saw my grandparents doing. And it was just such a wonderful way to grow up because it really led me to create the work I create now. It was also an incredible experience just to grow up with my grandparents in terms of what they devoted themselves to. My grandmother was so passionate about birds of prey, and both of them, I grew up really understanding the legacy that they had created. They were Aldo Leopold's first grad students, and they worked tirelessly for conservation and for wildlife preservation. They were really credited for helping save prairie chickens from going extinct. And when I knew them, they were just retired, or when I was born, they were just retiring from that work, but they never gave up their profession. They worked until, their last days on the planet. They worked with future biologists and grad students that lived in the house and continued the research. And so they were just a huge role model to me in terms of finding something that you feel incredibly passionate about, and also being connected to the land and nature, and then turning that into a passion where you can share that passion with others. As I mentioned, when I was a kid, Fran was really passionate about birds of prey, and she had a golden eagle that she had rehabilitated, and she was trying actively to raise young eagles in captivity. They were working to artificially inseminate an eagle and successfully raise a nest. That eagle went on to live at Cornell and did hatch eaglets about the time I was born. So my grandmother was just this huge role model. She was such a pillar of strength and also of passion. I just remembered her just jumping up out of a chair and running to go do something, always getting us and going out on the marsh. And I remember late into her 70s climbing trees. She sent me up a tree once to get a bunch of kestrel chicks to ban. And I climbed the tree and I got a kestrel chick and slowly tried to carry it down the tree, and then went up the tree and got another chick. And she scoffed at me and went climbing up the tree and stuffed all the kestrel chicks down her shirt in one go and climbed down the tree again and said, "That's how you do it." So she was just such a firecracker of energy and passion and strength. And I think any qualities that I have in myself that are strong or I credit to her and her incredible undying passion. And my grandfather, he was the quiet one, but he was also equally passionate. And I really credit him for teaching me the importance of being really attuned to detail, really being a careful observer. He used to put an owl pellet in front of me at night and to ask me to draw all the bones and determine what the owl had eaten, and then put the bones together into a skeleton. He was always asking me questions and really taught me the importance of learning about the world around you, and not just he always said, you can't just have book smart. I was an avid student at school, but he was always saying book smarts will only get you so far. You need to be a keen observer. And he would really taught me the principles of just sitting quietly and observing and being attuned to detail. He was also a role model to me in terms of teaching others. I spend a lot of my time going to schools and trying to get kids excited about writing and illustrating and about art. And I always think of my grandfather when I'm in schools, because my grandfather shared his knowledge with grad students. And for my entire childhood, I don't ever remembering have a day to myself with my grandparents. The house was always full of grad students and people who were there to study and learn. And so that's what he taught me, was that importance of education and knowledge and observation. So I was incredibly blessed to spend every year a significant part of the year with him. And another reason I was so incredibly lucky was the house was always full of animals. We always had baby kestrels we were raising, or baby barn owls, or baby great horned owl. And sometimes we'd have a rehab animal coming through, and Fran would let my sister and I feed the birds. And I grew up being very, very close to the birds. I was trying to find pictures of myself when I first started being an author and doing a lot of author talks. I needed some childhood pictures, and I couldn't find very many pictures where I'm either holding a bird or have a bird on my head. It seems to be a thing in our family that we're always, I think the camera only came out when there was a new bird to be hatched. This is a baby starling that a tree fell down, and a nest of starlings were disrupted. And Fran gave me the babies to take care of, so I could learn how to take care of wild things, and eventually help to take care of the owls and the birds of prey. So growing up with them was such a huge inspiration. And I felt really lucky because as a as a writer and an illustrator, most of my work revolves around nature and animals. Of the 35 books I've written, only 2 feature humans, and one of those stories features my grandparents. The rest are really devoted to animals and nature. And I was so fortunate to grow up so intimately close to animals, because I think in order to write about animals and to draw them particularly, you have to just really get into the soul of an animal. And there's nothing like getting up at dawn to feed baby owlets and being responsible for them and watching every intimate gesture as they grow up, to gain that understanding. So for that reason, I owe everything to them, and both them as role models and them for the exposure that they gave me to the natural world, and how that eventually led me to make my own career choices. In the beginning, I was really in awe of the fact that they were scientists. My father was a scientist, and I thought I would be a scientist. When I was little, I was really enamored with dinosaurs. By the time I was 14, I was really sure I wanted to be a paleontologist, and I started writing letters to museums all over the world asking if I could work on a dinosaur dig. And I wrote so many letters, particularly to the Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, which is up in Canada. I really wanted to work there because I had heard they had a bone bed that had the richest deposits of dinosaurs of any dig that was currently being where dinosaurs are being excavated. I wrote so many letters that the curator of the museum eventually called my school. I was writing on school letter paper, and he said, "I can see it might just be easier to say yes." He had written it at first to say, "No, you're too young." And then eventually I wore him down, and I was able to work on my first dinosaur dig. I turned 15 by the time summer came, and I got on a Greyhound bus and I went up and worked on this dinosaur dig with a team from all over the world. We had scientists from China, from Germany, Nepal, Canada. I was the only American on the dig. I was the only kid on the dig. And I was also the only woman on a dig, which I think that's starting to change. But back then it was an all male crew. I worked on the dig for 5 years. I got a degree as a geologist. I worked as a geologist and as a paleontologist. But eventually it was my passion for art that really won the day. And as the years went by, I realized what I really, really wanted to do was to get back to creating stories and art around nature. I think what I loved about dinosaurs wasn't so much digging them up. It was using my imagination to think about what they looked like. And I was always drawing pictures of them and really wanting to express my feelings about science. And I realized my grandparents, that was what was so truly remarkable about them. They weren't just research scientists. They believed passionately in sharing science with people around them and getting other people excited. That's part of why they were able to achieve the work that they were able to do. Was they liaison with communities. They talked to a lot of people. They got people excited about conservation. And that was so crucial to their work. And I think that's something that lives on in me, that I wanted to have a form of getting people excited about nature the way I was excited about nature. And for that reason, turning to writing and creating art was what eventually led me to my life as a children's book writer. So now I live in New Hampshire, in a place that I feel a kinship to Wisconsin. We live in a hardwood forest out in the middle of the woods, and the birds that I hear singing in the morning are similar to the birds that I heard as a child growing up in Wisconsin. I love my grandparents' house. For those of you who have visited the house, it was an old house that didn't have running water. It had an outhouse. It had so much charm and flavor. And my husband and I have tried to build a homestead that lives up to that feel, and work the land around us the way Fran and Hammy, put so much love into their homestead. This is my studio. This is my husband. He's a big part of my career. When we met, he was an engineer, but he quit his job as an engineer many years ago to help me with my career, because my career involves a lot of traveling and a lot of correspondence with schools and kids and publishing and editors and vetting information for books. And keeping my website going and filling book orders. And so he's the guy behind the writing and the illustrating. And it's another way that Fran and Hammy inspired us, because they were such a team. They worked together every day of their lives. And I think I really wanted that in my own life. I wanted to have a husband who was a business partner, working partner, that our goals were the same, our passion was the same. And I'm so lucky that I found somebody in Dave, somebody that would share my passion with me. So in the studio, I create work with a wide menagerie of pets. Here are 2 of my 3 cats, and on my shoulder, you can see a bird. I don't think I'll ever be able to live life without at least one bird in my life. I also have a little mouse. We have a menagerie of animals that come through the house, and everybody ends up posing for my work. I sculpt, I paint, I write, and create all the work that's inspired by the natural world around us. So for my children's books, when I was working as a geologist, my first step was to dream of being a painter. It took me a while to realize I wanted to write. I think in some ways, Fran inspired me to be a writer because she was a writer, but also she set the bar so high when I was a kid that I think I was intimidated to follow in her shoes in the first, when I first started, because her work was just so dearly loved. And her book, Eagle to the Sky and Walk Where the Moon Was Full, were such huge books in my childhood. And I never thought I could ever dare to follow in those footsteps. And so I created artwork for galleries for a number of years. And then when Fran passed away, and she was second, Hammy went first. So when Fran passed away, we had to close up the house, which was really the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. And my mom and I spent a month just going through the belongings, trying to figure out what things went where, and just trying to, close a lifetime of 60 years of them living in this house. And we found so many things that we expected to find that brought back so many good memories. And then we also found treasures that we never expected to find. And I think the greatest treasure of all was I was in the attic, what we call the ballroom, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of belongings. And one day I found a box that had inside of it was a foot tracing. And there was tons of envelopes. I opened up an envelope and there was a foot tracing that was on an old piece of newspaper that I could tell was in German. And I had no idea what this was. And I opened up more letters and there were more foot tracings. And I just thought this was a strange, unusual mystery. And I went running downstairs and I showed Mom these letters that also had lists of food and clothing. And my mom actually burst into tears because she said, "You found the foot tracings." And she started telling me about this relief effort that my grandparents had begun after World War II. They had received a letter from somebody they knew over in Germany. It was a person that I don't think that they had met in person, but my grandfather and the father of that family had worked on exchange letters because that father was also an ornithologist. And they were made aware of just how desperately people had lost their homes. They were in need of food and clothing. There were other scientists also being contacted, just talking about this incredibly difficult situation that was following post-war in Germany and other countries. And my mom started telling me how that for 3 years, they were sending food and clothing and packages over to Europe to help these families. And what started off with one family quickly mushroomed into hundreds of families. And I was fortunate enough to look at the envelopes and I saw addresses and I started trying to find families, and I ended up finding 34 families. I found some that were still living in Germany, a couple were living in Italy, some had emigrated to America. One family in particular had, my grandfather had actually gotten the father a job, so they had moved to America. One was Bert Heinrich, who ended up, winning the National Book Award for his own nature writing. One was Conrad Lorenz, who my mother had become an exchange child. They had become so close during the time of this relief effort that the families actually traded children after for a while. And my mother had lived with this family. Another family was Peter Cromer, who became the president of World Wildlife Federation. And these people were so kind to share with me the stories of what these packages of food and clothing and shoes meant to them during those years, candles and soap. And I received, some of them had saved the letters that my grandmother had written to them with the packages, and some had saved, and I found the letters that my grandmother had from them talking about how long they had been living with, barely any clothing and very little luxuries. And so I realized I wished I had been able to ask my grandmother about this incident when she was alive. And I wondered if other kids my age had known to ask their parents what this experience was like. And so I wanted to write a book about it. So again, my goal was to write to paint only for galleries. But when I found this story, I realized I really had a story I wanted to share with others. And so I ended up writing my first book, 1,000 Tracings, which traces this extraordinary relief effort that my grandparents were a part of. They got their friends and neighbors and other scientists to donate every article of clothing and food that they could afford and sending them off to these families in Europe. And I wrote the book kind of focusing on one family, even though there were actually hundreds and hundreds of families. I also chose to write the book in first person. So when the book came out, a lot of people thought I was a 70-year-old woman reminiscing about my childhood. But I'm writing the book for my mother was the little girl during the time, and the mother in the story was my grandmother. But I wrote it in first person because I really wanted, when a child reads the story, I really wanted them to be in this child's footsteps, and to just really understand the extraordinary relationship that these families who never met ended up having because of this incredible bond that was going back and forth between these letters and these donations of clothing. At one time, there was this heartbreaking letter my grandmother had written talking about how there were 1,000 tracings to fill, and meaning they needed to find 1,000 pairs of shoes, which back in that era and given the income they had was an extraordinary amount of energy they were putting into sending these packages off. So it was an honor and a privilege to be able to write this story and to meet the families that had been in my grandparents' life through this experience. And once I wrote this book, I knew that I had forever fallen in love with sharing stories with others, and I would never turn back from writing. And so it was really, at that point, when you start with a story like this, it's like, where do you go from there? Because it was just such an extraordinary story to get to tell. And I realized I needed to turn to my own life and kind of find my own way rather than following completely in my grandparents' footsteps. It was time for me to venture on into thinking about some of the things that I had done and what voice I had to bring to the table. And so one of the things I leaned on heavily was the fact that, starting at 15, I was working on dinosaur digs and getting to go to digs in different parts of the world, and being a part of opening the Tyrrell Museum. I was on the team that was, we were building the displays when that museum opened. And so an obvious choice for me was to write about dinosaurs and all the things that fascinated me as a kid, and to write the books that I wish I had had when I was a little kid. So that was kind of a place where I started. The other thing I realized was I had grown up with an incredible opportunity to be really up close with a lot of creatures, both through my grandparents, and then later that started a passion with me. So I volunteered at a place called the Wildlife Safari that raised cheetahs and rare and endangered animals. And I became good friends with various people who were working with wildlife and endangered animals. And so I was able to get behind the scenes sometimes for different animals. This particular picture is a day where I'm getting to hold this incredible mother giraffe's head. And what you don't see in the picture is she's actually in labor giving birth to a giraffe on that day. So it was just an incredible opportunity. And I realized I've really gotten to see a lot of amazing wildlife up close and personal. My parents have taken incredible wildlife photographs all through my childhood. We spent a lot of time living in bear country and getting to see things really up close and personal. And my parents particularly are really enamored with animal behavior. And that was something that Fran and Hammy were also extraordinarily adept at understanding. And so they taught me a lot about seeing animals in a way that a lot of kids don't have the opportunity now. And so one of the things I love to write about is animal behavior and really kind of dissecting the lives of animals and making them really relatable to kids and trying to inspire kids who may not have the opportunity to see animals up close and personal, but maybe as they grow older, they'll seek out nature and experiences to be in nature. So I have a whole series of animal behavior books where I will break down, these are written for very young kids, but I break down a certain behavior of an animal and then go into different examples in the animal world of that behavior. So, for example, Born in the Wild is about how animals are raised by their parents. Homes in the Wild is about how different animals make different homes for themselves, and then again followed by different examples of how animals go about doing this. So those are some of my books about the natural world and animal behavior. The other thing, though, when I watch my grandmother write, is she also loved to use her imagination. One of my favorite books growing up was her book, Walk When the Moon is Full. And of course, it had a different cover when I was a child, or when I was a child, but I had to use the cover that my mom painted for a newer version that she did a few years back. This book was such a huge inspiration to me as a kid about using your imagination to create a story. So I went back to some of the experiences I've had as a kid, getting to watch these extraordinary animals. I saw baby bear cubs sliding in the snow, and that inspired one of my most popular books, Red Sled, about a little bear who snitches a sled and has an adventure, and it gets more and more crazy, and more animals join in. And this is a really simple book. It was also kind of inspired by Fran and Hammy, because Fran used to have a thing where if somebody moved the axe when we were chopping wood and forgot to put the axe back, and so the next person went out to chop wood and the axe was missing, instead of blaming somebody, Fran would always say, Alphonse must have moved it. Or if somebody left the light on in the barn, instead of blaming somebody like who left the light on the barn, Fran would say, well, Alphonse must have left the barn light on. And I grew up wondering who this Alphonse was. And I would get up every morning and run out in the snow to look for Alphonse's foot tracks, because I just really wondered who Alphonse was. And as a child, I never met Alphonse, but as the years would go by, I came up with this imaginary character, Alphonse. And so that imaginary character kind of inspired the book. So these are, everything I paint is kind of a portrait of my childhood or things that I was inspired by. And there's little bits of Ron and Hammy that show up in these stories. Sometimes the story just starts for me with an image that pops in my head. I know a lot of writers think of a sentence or think of an opening line. For me, it often starts with a picture, and I don't know where that picture is going to lead me. I just know that there's something that really is pushing me to create a book around it. That was the case with a book, a recent book of mine called Even the Smallest Will Grow. I had this kind of dreamy picture of a child daydreaming, and this is kind of reminiscent to things I did when I was a child, and then wondering what I could write about that. And I just start with writing different things and finding, is there a story that I can solidify around it? And I started realizing about the magic of when you're a child, how everything is new and your experiences are new. And every day you have something that you've seen or done that you've never seen or done before, because the world is so new and so different. And I remember growing up with my grandparents, going out onto the marsh and seeing something different every day, but also kind of mixing that in with daydreaming, because a lot of the time we were spending sitting in blinds and trying not to swat mosquitoes, and sometimes very cold and sometimes very hot, and sometimes sitting for hours on end, and we weren't allowed to talk or make noise. And I'm so grateful for those experiences now, because I realize those experiences fostered the imagination that I rely on now as a writer. Some of my books start with an emotion. When You Need Wings started with an emotion. I was feeling anxiety a few years back. I had a thing I was dealing with health that was very anxiety inducing. And I started realizing whenever I'm feeling an emotion, I'm always trying to think about, well, how is that relevant to a child? And I remembered when I was a kid growing up in nature and living on an island, when it was time to actually start conventional school, it was terrifying because I hadn't been around a lot of kids. I had done some pretty extraordinary things and been exposed to a lot of things, but just going to a playground with a bunch of kids was something I had never done before. And so I wrote a book called When You Need Wings, which is about that feeling when you're being forced to do something that is terrifying, and how you can use your imagination to empower yourself to find a safe place and a place where you can get your strength and your courage, and eventually find the grace and the place where you can feel like you're in control. And so this is a book called When You Need Wings, which has gotten a lot of response in the recent couple of years because of, with the pandemic and with all the things kids are facing. I'm really grateful to have been able to write this book for youngsters and get letters from them and understand that some of the things I did as a child are now helping, kids as they are grappling with things. Some of my books start with just my love of nature and my love of science and all the things that my grandparents and my parents taught me. One of the things that I love to do with my husband is every year, in fact, we're about to go off in a couple of weeks, but every year we go trekking through Europe with a sketchbook, and we just hike and sketch, and I daydream and think about what's next. This is a tree where we often visit. It's in England. And when I was a geologist, we visited this tree for the first time, and I sat under it in the pouring rain and decided that I was going to be a writer and a children's book writer. And I went home and wrote 1,000 tracings. And I promised the tree that if I went home and successfully wrote that book, I'd come back and say thank you. So I went back and said thank you because the tree had given me the strength to write my first book. And so I went back and said thank you. And then I realized I wasn't done. I wanted to write more books. And I promised the tree I'd come back if I got more books written. So we've decided we can't go back every book because I've published quite a few books, but we've decided about every fifth book we go back and thank this tree. And I've written 35 books, so we've thanked this tree a lot. And second to the last time I saw this tree, I realized it was time to tell this tree story, because this tree has been sitting in England for about 1,500 years, and it sits right by Sudley Castle. It has witnessed the Civil War. It has witnessed that this is where the last queen of Henry VIII lived. There's so much history that this tree has witnessed. There was a cathedral built from the forest that surrounded this tree. You can see the cathedral from this tree off in the distance. It's just really an incredible tree. And I have stomped these grounds for decades now, sketching and drawing these trees. And I really wanted to pay tribute to these trees. Some of the trees that we see in this area are yews, and they're estimated to be 5,000 years old, which is something truly remarkable. In America, we don't have the good fortune of seeing trees this old. So it's time for me to write a book called The Wisdom of Trees, which was one of the true privileges to write about, was these ancient trees that I have grown up walking around and painting and studying. And the cool thing about, since the time that I first visited these trees, we have learned so much about how trees communicate, how they work together as a community. They're more like a colony of bees. They work as a community. So it starts off with a secret kingdom. I am a single beech, but I am not alone. Together with my fellow trees, we form a secret kingdom. And the book goes on to talk about how trees have a communication that spreads under their mycorrhizal fungi under the ground. When they send off signals to each other, they will let each other know when they're hungry, when they're damaged by disease, when they're threatened. It talks about, for young children, it talks about how trees help us control global warming. They clean the air of carbon pollutants. They control climate. If we cut all the trees, we cause desertification, but trees help with the ecosystem, keeping the balance. And I thought a lot about Fran and Hammy and the work they had done when I was writing this book, and all the people that have contributed to our understanding of trees. And the amazing thing with trees, if they're under attack by insects, they send up signals through their through their leaves that releases toxins and gets animals or insects to move on to the next tree. If one is damaged by a storm, it'll send out signals, and the trees around it will send it food to keep it alive. And that's how some of these ancient trees are able to stay alive for centuries and centuries. And so this was a book just celebrating the diversity of trees and all the things that we've grown to know about trees. And I wish I could have shared this one with my grandparents, because when they were alive, we didn't know about mycorrhizal fungi communicating and sending signals underground. And I think it would have absolutely blown their minds to understand this. So they really have been such huge influences for me. And one of the things I really was lucky was that they just set a household full of knowledge and learning and discipline. Fran was always writing books. Hammy was always editing her books. He was a big part of her writing, just as my husband Dave is a big part of my writing. They were always very they shared their knowledge, they shared their passions. They let my sister and I be a part of everything. They really didn't pander to us as kids. We really had to kind of keep up with the whole adult scene and work on the marsh. And sometimes we were pretty tuckered and pretty cold and pretty hot and pretty hungry. But it was just such an amazing experience. And also just the role models that they set for set a course and find a passionate life that you care about. And so every time I go out to create a book, they live on in me and working. And every time I go out into the field and look for a subject, I feel volume and volume of sketchbooks and journals, just like my mother and just like my grandparents did. For me, I write very differently than my grandmother. She always sat at a typewriter with a cigarette. And often she would disappear to the barn, and we were never allowed to disturb her when she was writing. For me, it took me a long time to realize that words don't come first for me. I always think in pictures. I draw my books first. And so I work at a storyboard and I plot out my whole book. I've written novels this way. This is how I write. I have a very visual brain. I think all the time I spent on the marsh watching birds was actually a great experience for me, because it really developed a visual side of my life. So I always start by words first, or pictures first, but then dive into the subject matter and the history. And the last book I'll share is a book that's coming out on Tuesday. I'm very excited. It's about dogs, and it's a history of our best friends. And this is just such a remarkable book. I wrote this during the pandemic when I had really time to dive into a subject, because this book covers 40,000 years of history. It's talking about wolves in Europe that were first domesticated or turned into domesticated dogs. It starts off with a poem. Huddled, tired and cold, we stare into darkness. The night is long and danger lurks. Distant howl, snap of twig, something large draws near. Amber eyes catch the light. Is it a threat? No, it is a friend. And then it goes into the history of these early primitive dogs and our relationship first with wolves and then with these dogs, and then on to how our survival really depended on our partnership with dogs. Our first, they helped us with hunting. They helped us with our first forms of locomotion. They helped us with our first ability to herd livestock, which enabled us to build villages. They, sadly have helped us with some pretty terrible times as well. Luckily, in the modern era, there's a lot more joyful examples of our relationships with dogs. And this covers the whole 40,000 years of the history of dogs. And it's coming out on Tuesday. And I'm really excited to share this with kids. And again, it just feels like there's little sprinkles of my grandparents throughout this book as well, because my fascination with evolution, stems from them. And so I really do feel like every time I step up to the plate to write a book, there's a part of Fran and Hammy showing up with that. I'm going to go back to the screen. Can you all see me now? Yes. Okay. So we have time for question, and I think we have a little time. Yeah. For questions, if any of you have questions. Yes, I do all my own illustrations. I I feel so fortunate that I can write and illustrate, because I would have no desire to write a book and have somebody else illustrate it. I know that a lot of people do that, but for me, the concept of the book is so tied up with the imagery that I see that it would be heartbreaking to then have somebody else visualize it. And for me, it's the joy of creating. I did occasionally illustrate other people's books. Usually that only happens though if I'm like, if I have an author friend and we start talking and we get excited about a book. I just signed a contract to do a book with Catherine Applegate because we're friends, and she wrote a book about an orphaned elephant. So I'm happy occasionally to illustrate and not write, but I would never write and not illustrate. Oh, over the years, I've worked with a lot. My first one was Disney. Well, it was Hyperion. And then right after I signed, Disney bought them out. So I had a 2-book deal, and I did my second book with Disney. And then I left because we had a different vision. I've worked with, I work right now with Simon and Schuster and McMillan, and I just signed a book with Harper Collins and Abrams. I have 4 books right now with all those big presses, and those are kind of my main presses. But I've worked with probably 9 different presses over the years. Children's books is, people move around a lot, editors move around a lot. A lot of times, you want to try to keep a list with a house, but a lot of times you have to move a lot too, because there's a lot of change that happens. Well, especially in recent years, because presses are being consolidated and stuff. So you end up getting a lot of experience working with a lot of different people, there's pros and cons to that. Yeah. Well, every book varies. The longest book I ever took to create was my book called Mary's Monster, which was a graphic. It was a novel, but every page is illustrated and every page had a poem. And it was about Mary Shelley and the creation of Frankenstein. She was a pregnant teenage runaway. Mary Shelley was a pregnant teenage runaway when she wrote Frankenstein. And that's the one other book I did that features humans instead of animals. That book took 6 years because it's 350 pieces of art and 350 poems. So it was, and a colossal amount of research. Some books like Red Sled they take 3 years from conception to publication, but you don't work on it every day for 3 years. I do work all the time. I'm trying to change that. Fran was a hard worker, and she incited in me discipline, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. But I also am reaching a stage in my life where I'm realizing maybe working 10-hour days, 7 days a week isn't the healthiest thing to do. So I'm trying to reel it in. Of course, I sculpt when I'm not writing, but I've been working since 2005 on those 35 books. And I work Christmas, I work Thanksgiving, I work Sundays. I love this. I feel incredibly blessed to do this work. Yes, that is it. Well, it's a tricky balance. And there's certain aspects to it that make it so that you have to publish with more than one publisher. Adult novelists tend to work with one publisher because adult novelists tend to do 1 book a year. And so adult fiction doesn't change quite as rapidly as children's books. Children's books changes very rapidly, and people move around a lot. The only way to move up is often for an editor to leave the house, and then you go with your editor sometimes, or sometimes you stay with your house, but it creates a lot of chaos. In my best scenario, I have a fiction publisher and a nonfiction publisher, and I've had my fiction published at Simon & Schuster for many years. But before Simon & Schuster, I moved from Disney to Penguin to Simon & Schuster because I was following my editor as she went up the ranks. And then I have my nonfiction at McMillan. But then I'm illustrating a book with Catherine at Harper, and I have to go to a different house because I have to go and illustrate with her house because that's where she publishes. So you tend to try to get a loyalty with the press, but then sometimes your editor leaves and you get caught in the, in the crossfires of, do you stay with the house? Or in the case like Disney bought out my publisher and then I wasn't happy at that publisher, so I had to leave. But a lot of these projects take 4 to 5 years to come to fruition. So you're signed up with that publisher, but then it's no longer the house that you're meant to work with. So then you start making a relationship with the next publisher. So it just happens. We all in the industry, we all bemoan the era when like E.B. White could stay at one publisher and have the same editor for his entire career. But that's rare. That's rarely the case now for children's book illustrator. We're often forced to move because our editors are moving, and so we're following them. Yes, that is a huge part of this world. And I wish I had Fran's genes or more Fran's genes in me because she loved it and she was so good at it. And I was shy and I did not go into children's books to do this. And every day I step up. Sometimes I'm, talking in front of 1,000 people and I think, oh, I wish Fran was here. I wear her bracelet to give me some energy. Over the years, though, I've learned I'm so grateful for the opportunity because it's really helped me stop being shy, and it's really brought incredible relationships into my life and friends and people that I've met that I just cherish that I would never have met, with any other way. Before COVID, I was on the road about 4 months of the year, and I was speaking to about 40,000 kids a year, and also librarians and adults, and just a lot of speaking. Then COVID hit, and everything changed. And it's slowly coming back, but it's a different landscape. And in some ways, it's horrible, and we miss the days before. And in some ways, it's a blessing. And we're still just trying to figure that out. I don't want to go back to 4 months of the year on the road, but I also I miss it terribly. So somewhere in between would be lovely. And I have learned to enjoy it. But I don't think I'll ever be the shining star that my grandmother was. She was such a phenomenon when it came to that. Thank you. Yes, thank you. My website is just www.litajudge.me. So if you Google me, you can see my website. And I had an Etsy shop up until a week ago, and I've put that down because I have so much work right now, which is great. But I've gone back to having people just order books through. You can get it through any local bookstore. You can get it on Amazon, of course, too. But please support your indie bookstores if you can. Any book that I have, they can order. And if you can't find a book, I do have books here as well that I do ship out. And I'm on Instagram, Facebook. If you're interested in seeing, I post very regularly to those. So if you want to see little snippets of art or projects that I'm working on, find me on Instagram or Facebook. And I've gone off Twitter as of this week. I feel like if NPR is not going to be on Twitter, then I am not going to be on it either. So, but I am pretty easy to find out there on the web. Yes, I have not written about ginkgos exclusively, but I have ginkgos featured in 2 of my books because I've done prehistoric books. And the first thing I did when I bought this piece of land was I planted a ginkgo tree to try to have that connection to the ancient forests. And it's in the center. We call it the Axis Mundi. It's in the center between the studio and the house. because yes, they are such a phenomenal tree. And having grown up with a fascination for the prehistoric world, I fell in love with the ginkgo trees pretty early on. Oh, wonderful. Oh, I love that. Not many people do that. Yes, very much so. To be honest, these are really, really difficult times. I mean, they're difficult for all of us, absolutely all of us. And the children, it's just heartbreaking. But yes, my books that talk about evolution, my book Mary's Monster, I almost daily get asked to speak out on it, to sign petitions, sign letters, to speak out. And it's very difficult because it also puts you in target, for trollers and haters. And it's so hard to find the balance between doing the right thing and speaking out and not also having just hatred rain down on your head. And creatively, in the last 3 years, COVID completely shut down publishing for a while. That was devastating. The book banning has been devastating. The Trump era and the consequences to the dialogue of what stories need to be told and voices, and that's been incredibly hard. And there's not a single day. I went from passion from the instant I woke up to the instant I went to bed. You just like, I couldn't think of doing anything other than this. And I'll be honest, the last year has been pretty tough. The hatred, it's so hard. You're just trying to create books for young kids and inspire them and get them to love art and nature and writing and creating. And you've got a bullseye on your back with these haters. It's been incredibly challenging. I have so many friends who are even more targeted than me. And so I always tell myself, buck up, but it's tough times to be a creator. We live in a very judgmental society where everybody feels liberty to judge and say anything, but now it's turned into hatred, which is so beyond the pale that it can be challenging sometimes to sit down at the desk and feel like you just want to duck under cover. And sometimes I think I just want to become a potter and, not have this directed at me. But then I realized Ron and Hammy wouldn't have done that. And I see friends who are so much more on the hotlines, and I keep going and I keep signing the petitions and I keep speaking out when I can. Have I personally? I'm, yeah, I personally haven't done any history of it. I have boxes and boxes of information because I might write that book someday. It's interesting. When I first started, my first book was about Fron and Hammy, and I really thought I would write that book about the prairie chickens. And then I quickly realized it's almost like I could hear Fron. I quickly realized I needed to find my own path and find my way. And now I feel like I'm writing a book right now that's very autobiographical and very much about my childhood, and it will be out in 2025. I feel like as a young writer, I needed to find my own voice. And I guess I'm aging myself. I've gotten to a place now where I'm looking back a lot more than I used to, particularly in the last couple of years because of some things that happened. And so I'm grateful to my mother, particularly, who's saved so much of the information that my grandparents had. And she's worked so hard to tirelessly preserve all that information. And I'd also like to write about my grandmother's work with the Golden Eagles too. I find that story really fascinating. But I think I will be writing about those things in the future now that I've gotten to a place where I feel like I've kind of found my own voice. My grandparents, it's such a blessing to live with them as role models, but it can also be a big shadow to crawl out from under and find your own voice for. And I know that my grandmother would have really approved of that. And yet now I feel like time is fleeting and we're not here forever, and somebody needs to preserve that history. And so I probably will be turning to write about that more and more. Oh, I would cherish that. Yeah, if you have one, I would absolutely cherish that. If you go to my website, www.litajudge.me, there's an email contact, or I'm sure Casey can give you my email as well. I know there's people in the audience who have my email, but yes, I would very much treasure that. I feel so honored. Someday it'll happen that nobody's alive that knew them, but I still get contacted almost weekly by somebody who knew my grandparents, or asks, are you the Hammerstrom granddaughter? They'll know me through my work and make that connection every time. What's that? I would love that. That would be a real treasure. Yes. Thank you for having me. Have a wonderful evening with the next presentation too. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.